The clock on the prison wall ticked slowly. Inside a quiet room at the Florida State Prison, a man sat alone at a small metal table. It was October 5, 1984. In less than 24 hours, the state of Florida would carry out the execution of Arthur Frederick Goode III. The guards outside the door spoke softly. The hallway lights were dim. The air inside the prison felt heavy, like a storm that had not yet broken. Goode looked calm, too calm. He folded his hands and stared at the table in front of him. Some people in the prison wondered the same thing. What was going through his mind during his final hours? But to understand that night, we have to go back to the moment everything changed. Because years earlier, in a quiet Florida community, a child disappeared, and what investigators would soon discover would shock the entire country. Long before that final night, Arthur Goode was just another young man growing up in Florida. He was born in 1954. To neighbors, he sometimes seemed polite and quiet, but people who knew him closely often noticed something strange. He behaved differently from other people his age. He struggled to fit in. Sometimes he told unusual stories. Sometimes he acted in ways that confused those around him. As the years passed, people began to worry about his behavior. Teachers noticed it. Family members noticed it. And eventually, police would notice it too. But in the early years, no one imagined the story would end the way it did. In 1976, everything changed. One afternoon, a young boy named Jason Vernoy was reported missing. Jason was only 10 years old. His family searched everywhere. Neighbors joined the search. Police began asking questions. Where had Jason last been seen? Who had spoken to him? Did anyone notice anything unusual? Days passed with no answers. Then investigators received a strange report. Someone had seen Jason riding in a car with a man. That man was Arthur Goode. Police quickly found Goode and brought him in for questioning. At first, he spoke calmly, but as detectives continued asking questions, the story began to change. Then something unexpected happened. Goode began talking, not nervously, not angrily, but almost casually. He started describing things investigators had not even asked about, details that no one else could have known. The room became silent. Detectives realized they were hearing a confession. Soon after, Arthur Goode was arrested. The case quickly became national news. A child had vanished, and the suspect was calmly admitting involvement. For investigators, the situation was disturbing, but what they would discover next made the case even more shocking. Because during questioning, Goode revealed something else, something that made detectives freeze in their chairs. He said Jason Vernoy was not the only victim. Police began looking deeper into Goode's past, and they found another case. Earlier that same year, another child had disappeared in Florida. His name was James Patrick Hanrahan. He was also 10 years old. For months, his case had remained unsolved. But now investigators realized the two cases might be connected. When detectives asked Goode about the earlier disappearance, he did not deny it. Instead, he began describing events that linked him directly to the crime. The investigation expanded quickly. Police searched locations Goode mentioned. Evidence was gathered. Witnesses came forward. The pattern was becoming clear. 2 missing children, 1 suspect, and a confession that seemed almost unbelievable. Communities across Florida were shocked. Parents became fearful. The story spread across the country. How could someone commit such crimes and speak about them so calmly? The question haunted investigators. But the legal process had only just begun. Arthur Goode's trial began soon after his arrest. The courtroom was filled with reporters, families, and curious observers. Prosecutors presented the evidence carefully. Witnesses described the investigation. Police explained how Goode's statements led them to key discoveries. But the defense had a different argument. They believed Goode suffered from serious mental illness. Psychiatrists examined him. Some said he understood what he had done. Others believed he struggled with deep psychological problems. The courtroom debates became intense. Was Arthur Goode fully responsible for his actions? Or was his mind so troubled that he could not truly understand them? The jury listened to every word. The families of the victims waited anxiously. After days of testimony and arguments, the jury made its decision. Arthur Goode was found guilty. The judge later sentenced him to death. The years that followed were filled with appeals. Lawyers argued about Goode's mental condition. Some experts believed he should not face execution because of his psychological state. Others believed the crimes were too serious for any other punishment. Courts reviewed the case again and again. Each time, the outcome remained the same. The sentence stood, and eventually, a date was set. October 5, 1984. The day Arthur Goode would be executed at Florida State Prison. As that day approached, the prison prepared carefully. Executions followed strict procedures. Witness lists were finalized. Security increased. Prison officials reviewed every step. Meanwhile, inside the prison walls, debates continued. Some people believed justice was being carried out. Others believed the case raised difficult questions about mental health and the death penalty. Newspapers across the country reported on the approaching execution. The story had become one of the most discussed criminal cases of its time. But inside the prison, the focus was simple. Time. The final 24 hours had begun. Arthur Goode spent his last day inside a small cell on death row. The cell was plain. Concrete walls, a narrow bed, a small metal sink. Outside, guards quietly watched the hallway. Prison routines continued, but everyone knew this day was different. During the evening, Goode was offered a final meal. The request was simple. Prison staff prepared it carefully. This was part of the procedure followed for every execution. Later that night, he spoke briefly with the chaplain. Some inmates use these moments to reflect, pray, or speak about their lives. Others remained silent. Each person faced the moment differently. Goode appeared calm. That calmness puzzled many people who observed him. Was he accepting his fate, or was something else going on inside his mind? No one could say for sure. As midnight passed, the prison became quieter. Most of the lights in the building were dim. Only a few guards walked the corridors. The execution chamber nearby was already prepared. Witnesses would arrive in the morning. Officials checked every piece of equipment again. Everything had to follow strict legal procedures. Every step had been rehearsed. There was no room for mistakes. Inside his cell, Arthur Goode sat on the edge of his bed. The clock continued ticking. Every minute brought him closer to the end. But then, something unexpected happened. A prison official entered the hallway with urgent news. A last-minute legal request had arrived. Lawyers were asking the courts to stop the execution. The request raised serious questions about Goode's mental condition. The prison staff paused. The execution team waited. Everyone looked toward the phones that connected them to the courts. Would the execution continue? Or would the final hours suddenly change everything? The answer had not arrived yet, and the clock was still ticking. The hallway outside the death row cells grew very quiet. The clock continued ticking. Inside Florida State Prison, prison officials waited for one thing: a call from the courts. A last-minute legal request had arrived only hours before the scheduled execution of Arthur Frederick Goode III. His lawyers were asking the courts to stop the execution. They argued that Goode's mental health raised serious questions. The prison staff had seen this happen before. Many death row cases ended with emergency appeals filed at the final moment. Sometimes the courts delayed the execution, sometimes they did not. But until the answer came, everything inside the prison was paused. Even the guards walked more slowly. Even the phones seemed louder than usual, because every ring might carry the decision that would change the night. Inside his small death row cell, Arthur Goode sat quietly. The room was simple: concrete walls, a narrow metal bed, a small desk, a single dim light hanging above him. He had been there for years. Years of court hearings, years of appeals, years of waiting. For many inmates, the waiting was the hardest part of death row. Days turned into months, months turned into years, and every time, a new appeal was denied. The end moved a little closer. For Goode, that end was now only hours away. Yet those who watched him that night noticed something unusual. He did not seem afraid. He spoke calmly with the guards. He answered questions politely. He even asked about the time. But behind that calm behavior, prison officials knew the situation was serious. Because outside the prison walls, lawyers were still fighting. Late that night, Goode met with his legal team. The meeting took place inside a small room near the death row cells. The conversation was quiet and serious. His lawyers explained the situation. They had filed an emergency appeal with the courts. The argument focused on Goode's mental health history. For years, psychiatrists had debated whether he fully understood his actions and the punishment he faced. Some doctors believed he suffered from deep psychological problems. Others believed he understood exactly what he had done. The courts had reviewed these arguments many times before, but his lawyers believed one final attempt was worth making. If the court accepted their argument, the execution could be stopped, at least temporarily. If the court rejected it, the execution would continue in the morning. Goode listened carefully. He nodded, but he did not ask many questions. The lawyers eventually stood up to leave. Before they walked out of the room, one of them turned back. "We'll keep fighting," he said quietly. Goode simply replied, "Thank you." Hours passed. The prison remained calm, but the tension never disappeared. Officials checked the execution chamber again. Witness lists were confirmed. Doctors reviewed procedures. Everything had to follow strict legal rules. Executions were not rushed. They were controlled and documented. Every step was watched carefully. Meanwhile, outside the prison gates, reporters had begun arriving. News vans parked along the road. Journals prepared their cameras. This case had drawn national attention. Many people across the country were waiting to hear what would happen. Back inside the prison, the night moved slowly. At one point, a guard stopped outside Goode's cell. "Do you need anything?" the guard asked. Goode looked up from his bed. "No," he replied calmly. The guard nodded and continued walking. For prison staff, moments like this were difficult. Many officers had worked at the prison for years. They had witnessed executions before, but each case carried its own weight. Some officers avoided conversation. Others tried to treat the inmate with quiet respect. Either way, everyone knew the night was far from over. Because the court's decision had still not arrived, just before sunrise, the phone rang inside the prison office. Everyone in the room froze. A senior official answered the call. The voice on the other end spoke calmly. The decision had been made. The emergency appeal had been denied. The execution would proceed as scheduled. The room fell silent. The final hours had officially begun. News of the decision quickly reached the death row corridor. Prison officials approached Goode's cell. A senior officer explained the situation. The courts had rejected the final appeal. The execution would move forward later that morning. Goode listened quietly. Then he nodded. "Okay," he said. There was no shouting, no anger, just a quiet acceptance that surprised many people around him. Soon after, preparations began. Goode was allowed to meet with the chaplain. For many inmates, these final meetings were deeply emotional. Some prayed, some spoke about their lives, some remained silent. The chaplain and Goode talked for some time. Their conversation was private. As the morning continued, the prison prepared for the final procedure. The execution chamber inside Florida State Prison was ready. Witnesses would soon arrive. Among them were journalists, legal observers, and prison officials. Doctors reviewed medical protocols. Technicians inspected equipment. Everything had to work exactly as required by law. There could be no mistakes. Shortly before the scheduled time, Goode was escorted from his cell. 2 guards walked beside him. The hallway was quiet. Only the sound of footsteps echoed against the walls. As he walked, some guards watched silently. Others looked away. Moments like this were never easy. The group stopped briefly in a holding area near the execution chamber. Here, Goode was asked if he had any final requests. He shook his head. Then the door ahead slowly opened. Inside waited the execution chamber, and beyond that chamber, the final moments of the case that had shocked Florida years earlier. But before the procedure could begin, prison officials needed to confirm one final detail. Arthur Goode was given the chance to speak his last words, and what he said next would leave many witnesses stunned. The room was quiet. Inside the execution chamber at Florida State Prison, the witnesses sat behind a thick glass window. Reporters, prison officials, legal observers. Everyone in the room knew they were about to watch the final moments of one of Florida's most talked about criminal cases. At the center of the chamber stood the electric chair. It had been used before, and today, it would be used again. The door opened. 2 guards walked in first. Behind them was Arthur Frederick Goode III. The room stayed silent as he entered. The witnesses watched closely. Some leaned forward slightly, others sat very still. Goode walked calmly across the room. His steps were slow but steady. For a moment, he looked around the chamber. Then the guards gently guided him to the chair. Prison officials followed strict procedures. Every movement was careful. Every step had been rehearsed. Goode sat in the chair. Leather straps were placed around his arms, legs, and chest. Technicians secured the equipment required by law. Doctors and officials observed everything closely. In the witness room, no one spoke. The only sound was the quiet movement of papers and the occasional shifting of chairs. Some reporters held notebooks. Others watched through the glass with serious expressions. They knew they were witnessing a moment that would soon be reported across the country. Before the procedure could begin, prison officials asked the final question. Did he have any last words? The room seemed to grow even quieter. Goode lifted his head slightly. Then he began to speak. His voice was calm. Witnesses later described the moment as unexpected. Many people had assumed his final words would be short, but instead, he spoke longer than anyone expected. He talked about his life. He spoke about the crimes that had brought him there. He even spoke about the legal process that had followed. Some people in the witness room looked surprised. Others simply listened. For years, the case had been debated in courtrooms and newspapers. But now, in this final moment, the man at the center of it all was speaking directly to the world. Outside the prison walls, reporters were already waiting. News vans lined the road near the prison entrance. Telephones were ready. Editors across the country were preparing headlines. Everyone was waiting for the same message. When the execution was complete, the news would spread quickly. But inside the prison, time seemed to move slowly. The final preparations continued. Officials checked their watches. The scheduled time had arrived. The prison warden stepped forward. He read the official statement. The document confirmed the sentence ordered by the court. It confirmed that all legal appeals had been completed. And it confirmed that the execution would now proceed according to the laws of the state of Florida. When the warden finished speaking, he nodded to the technicians. The room remained silent. Witnesses watched through the glass window. Some held their breath. Others looked down briefly. Moments later, the procedure was carried out according to the prison's established process. Doctors monitored the situation carefully. Officials observed the procedure. Everything followed the strict rules required by law. After a short time, a doctor stepped forward. He checked the inmate carefully. Then he turned toward the prison officials. The official time of death was recorded. The room remained quiet for several seconds. Then the witnesses slowly began to leave. Reporters gathered their notes. Prison staff quietly exited the chamber. Outside, the waiting journalists received confirmation. The execution had been completed. The story spread across the country within minutes. Television broadcasts interrupted regular programming. Newspapers prepared special editions. Across the United States, people discussed the case once again. For some people, the execution represented justice carried out by the legal system. For others, the case raised difficult questions about mental health, punishment, and the death penalty. Those debates would continue long after that day. But one thing was certain. The case of Arthur Goode had become one of the most widely discussed criminal cases of its time. The investigation, the confessions, the courtroom battles, and the final hours inside Florida State Prison. Each part of the story revealed something about the complex world of criminal justice. Years later, the case would still appear in documentaries, legal studies, and news retrospectives. Historians and legal experts would examine the trial. Psychiatrists would study the mental health arguments raised during the appeals. Journalists would continue asking questions about how the justice system handled cases like this. Because stories like this are not only about crimes, they are also about the difficult decisions societies must make when facing the darkest actions committed by human beings. And so, the story that began years earlier with a shocking crime ended quietly inside a prison chamber. A final statement, a final record, a final moment written into history. But for many people who followed the case, one question continued to linger long after the prison lights dimmed that day. Not just what happened, but why. If you enjoy true crime documentaries, prison life stories, criminal investigation content, and real crime history. Consider supporting the channel by liking this video and subscribing for more documentary content about crime cases, prison systems, and investigative storytelling from around the world.